and welcome to today's webinar, where, as Bethan says, we'll be looking at adaptive learning at secondary level with some examples from Adapt, the new adaptive learning product from Collins. So, in terms of what we're going to cover today, I'm going to start by giving you some background on adaptive learning, why it's important and how it adds value in classrooms. Then we'll take a look at Adapt specifically, including having a look at the platform together to see it in action. Then there will be an opportunity to recap and hopefully some questions from you. And as Bethan says, do think up any questions as we go through, either pop them into the Q&A box or do so at the end. I'll be glad to address them when the presentation comes to an end. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about adaptive learning? So this chart that you can see, first of all, shows the basic differences between what you might call traditional learning and adaptive learning. You might well be familiar with some adaptive software, may even already be using it in some way in your schools. A major finding of learning science is that every learner is unique and therefore has unique needs. So adaptive learning replicates at scale the way a human tutor teaches, adapting and adjusting to meet the needs of every learner in the class. So it combines both learning science and also sophisticated technology to deliver personalized learning outcomes that adjust in real time. Where learning resources are adaptive, they change in response to the learner's input. So they're constantly evolving whilst they're being used. This means ultimately that everybody gets more of what they need, more time and focus, which means more relevance and ultimately more successful learning. And to kind of express those benefits in another way, automation means more time saved in the planning and marking, creating more time for teaching opportunities, genuine teaching opportunities. This brings more focus for learners because every student sees what they most need themselves, which makes it all the more relevant. And as a result, students are more engaged with their learning because it's meaningful to them, which brings greater learning success. Or in short, adaptive learning is valued because it brings improved outcomes for learners. And it's increasingly seen as a key factor in closing attainment gaps and helping students to reach their potential in learning. I want to take a look at a couple of pieces of research which are relevant to the topic of adaptive learning and to the Adapt platform. So the first is a piece of research on learning done by Benjamin Bloom in the 80s. The graphs you can see show test results from students. So the horizontal axis is how well they did, their marks basically, and the vertical axis is the number of students. So what you can see, first of all, the lower curve, the left-hand curve, if you like, or the one that starts furthest to the left, shows how students performed in a test taken after a regular lesson. So there's a real range. Some did very well, of course, others less well, with the majority falling somewhere in the middle, as you might expect. The second curve shows the results when a mastery-based teaching approach was introduced. So the teacher asked questions in the classroom during the lesson to gauge how well students were learning and adjusted the lesson and the delivery accordingly. So you can see that the test results were better using this approach. That's the second dotted curve, just to the right of the first one. So slightly narrower and with a higher kind of average mark. But the best results, the curve on the right-hand side, the solid curve, are from students who received one-on-one tutoring. So here the results are skewed highly to the right, as I said, and tightly grouped, meaning that most students scored more highly. The reason I highlight this is really just to say that adaptive learning uses software to go some way to recreating at scale the results you'd get if you could tutor each student. So it's about leveling the playing field and letting every student achieve their maximum potential improving proficiency across the board, and especially helping those who need the most support. Um, and then on to the second piece of research that's relevant here. So studies show that students, in fact, all humans, are generally bad at evaluating their own performance. And the worst performers massively overestimate their capabilities or abilities. So Dunning and Kruger conducted a study in the late 90s that's been replicated dozens of times. They administered tests to groups of individuals that tested their knowledge. And as is totally normal, as you would expect, the scores varied. So some people scored highly, others poorly. They then asked the participants how well they thought they'd done. So the best performers typically underestimate their performance. But as you can see from the graph, looking at the two lines, the poor and especially the worst performers, so over on the left-hand side of the graph, massively overestimate their scores. And this is a trait that can lead to problems when learning. Most people, or people often, don't realize that they don't know something or can't do something. And we can call this unconscious incompetence. So not knowing something and not realizing that you don't know it. And I'll certainly come back to that phrase later on in the presentation. And that ability to reflect on your own learning, so essentially what you know about what you know, is what's known as metacognition, which is a term I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And continuing on that theme, it's worth just sticking with that point for a moment, because when I come to talk about ADAPT, the product that we'll be talking about later on in the presentation, you'll see that metacognition is a very key part of how it works. It's kind of at its core. So again, broadly speaking, what we mean by metacognition in a classroom context is what students know about what they know. It's all about thinking about your learning, and it can be before, during, or after that learning taking place. So metacognition develops our skills of reflection, and our confidence in our own knowledge, as well as promoting so-called softer skills like a growth mindset, resilience, and grit. And just a quick word to reassure you, I guess, that metacognition isn't a fad or an ideology for the few. I'm sure it's something that that lots of you will have come across, and it's being talked about more and more as an essential part of teaching and learning in schools globally. And it's something that's happening in classrooms everywhere. This quote from the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK: metacognition is the highest impact, lowest cost strategy, especially for disadvantaged learners. And I guess the missing part of that is in terms of improving learning outcomes. And if you'd like to hear more about metacognition and how to apply it more broadly in the classroom, there's a fantastic video on our website, collinsadapt.co.uk. One of the tabs is called Why It Works. The video is by a memory and learning expert from a UK university called Dr. Jonathan Firth, who's been involved with the development of the ADAPT product and who writes brilliantly on this topic. And that's a good moment really to move to ADAPT, so the adaptive learning product from Collins. So adaptive learning isn't a universally defined term, it would be fair to say. It's used by different people and different companies to mean slightly different things. So when some platforms talk about adaptivity or adaptive learning, or personalization is another word often used with these kinds of products, they typically mean what you might call curriculum adaptivity. So choosing which courses to assign to someone based on some information about them. But where we think the real value comes is not necessarily just at the curriculum level, but within learning assignments and learning tasks. So what we call next task or intra-task adaptivity. So once a learner begins learning something, it's the sort of adaptivity that will adjust in real time to optimize the learner's path through to mastery, which is the end goal in ADAPT for all learners, no matter how they get there. So that's where ADAPT comes in. ADAPT combines adaptive learning and metacognition, the two things we've talked about so far, to produce a totally unique learning experience. In ADAPT, students create their own unique learning pathways by reflecting on their confidence levels alongside their subject knowledge. No two learner journeys through the same piece of content are the same. And meanwhile, teachers, we haven't forgotten about teachers. Of course, we've got an audience of teachers today. Teachers access detailed reporting data that enriches insights into students' understanding, into their confidence, and into their learning gaps, the sorts of things that can make a real difference in the classroom. Also important to add, ADAPT was the winner earlier on this year at the end of March of the secondary digital learning product category at the BET Awards, Education Technology Awards. It was shortlisted in a couple of other categories as well, for primary digital learning product, for maths, and also for collaboration with a school for some work we did with one of our pilot schools that's still still using the ADAPT platform today. And I just wanted to read this brief excerpt from the judges' comments on what made ADAPT an award-winning product as far as they were concerned. So they felt that ADAPT was a well-designed product with an impressive approach, personalized for individual learning pathways, and they particularly liked that metacognition was embedded and pupils could evaluate their confidence level prior to starting a module, a solid product that works for teachers and pupils alike. So really just to highlight the fact that it was the metacognition, which is kind of unique to ADAPT in terms of the other products out there in this space, that the judges felt made ADAPT a kind of an award-worthy product. So just before I launch into a demo, because I'd like to show you ADAPT, how it works for students, how it works for teachers, just a note on how ADAPT itself makes use of metacognition, which is obviously something I've been talking about so far. Metacognition is the key USP of ADAPT, and it's the key element that creates each student's unique learning pathway. So each student's experience in ADAPT is unique, excuse me, because they all have different knowledge and confidence levels in different areas and different starting points as well. But they all ultimately reach mastery. Crucially, in ADAPT, this is underpinned by confidence in that knowledge that they've developed. So how exactly does ADAPT use this metacognition to ensure every student gets their own adaptive learning experience? Well, if you look at this this page here, I've included just a screenshot from the ADAPT platform from a student's perspective. So you'll see this or other examples of this in a second when I launch the platform. But essentially, when a student first launches any activity, the first thing they're going to see is a diagnostic question, which could take many forms. In this case, it's a fill-in-the-blank type question. But then every question they do see is accompanied by these 4 confidence buttons. So not only are they having to answer the question, but in order to submit their answer, they're having to indicate whether they know it, they're confident that they know it, or think they know it, are not sure, or have no idea. And those 2 bits of information are going to be equally important when the algorithm that powers ADAPT is determining where the student should go next. So if they answer a question incorrectly, then you can certainly expect them to encounter a similar question or a question on the same topic later on in the assignment. And likewise, if they're answering, even if they are answering correctly, but with a low degree of confidence, again, you can expect that to you can expect them to face more questions in that area later on. So to summarize, what we see next depends on how we've responded, not only the answer given, but also the confidence level expressed. And so with that, so if you bear with me just 1 second, I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare. And then a thumbs up or a cheer from somebody to say that they can see the...
Yeah, all good. We can see.
Perfect. Thank you, Bethan. So next part of the webinar, we're going to look at ADAPT. How does it look to a student? How does it look to a teacher? Help you to understand how it could work for you in your school. So starting off with a student's perspective. So I've logged in here as a student, and actually it's worthwhile just showing you how I got here. On the Collins Adapt website, which I mentioned, which is collinsadapt.co.uk, one of the tabs here is Take a Quick Look, which is the page I'm on here. And these links, without you needing to register, will take you straight into the Adapt platform with a kind of a small amount of content, a small number of modules to enable you to view the platform from either a student or a teacher's perspective and understand how it works. Now let's get back to my other page. There we are. So I'm logged in as a student, as I say. This is what we call the student dashboard. Very simple layout. At the moment, I've just got some tasks to complete in this section called To Do. So it's reasonable to assume that in this scenario, these are modules that my teacher or teachers have set for me. So that's the kind of default in ADAPT, really, is that what the students can see when they log in is what's been shared with them by their teachers as part of assignments. A little bit later, I will tell you about another way that ADAPT can be used, more kind of in a way that kind of hands over a bit more control to the student or to the learner, but that's generally the kind of the most common use case. So these modules are all ones that have been assigned to me that I need to complete. As I do complete them, they'll shift over to a column on the left-hand side called Previous Learning. And what will then happen is that periodically modules that I've already completed will reappear in To Do as what we call revisit tasks. So that's a really key part of the adaptive process in ADAPT. What those revisit tasks are going to do, crucially, is not take them through the entire task again. That would be a waste of time. It would include all the things that they'd clearly demonstrated they already understood. Instead, what it's going to do is just kind of zone in on those one or two things that they struggled with most first time round. And it'll continue to do that until it's satisfied that they've fully mastered the content in that module. So, right, what should we pick this time? Let's try... I think we did physics this morning, so we'll try some biology, the heart. So I'm going to select one of the cards from this dashboard and then just show you what the learning content looks like from a student's perspective. Okay, so in this case, we're starting, well, as I mentioned while I was running through the presentation, what's always going to happen when I first select a card is that it will launch, first of all, a diagnostic question. So that diagnostic question will be based on a very specific learning objective. There are two reasons for that, one of which is from the kind of the adaptive engine's perspective, it's really important that the content is broken down into those really granular learning objectives so as it can determine exactly what they've understood and what they're yet to understand. The other kind of crucial element there, which I'll come to when I show you the teacher side of ADAPT, is that it allows you as teachers to see, again, right down to that very granular level where your students are struggling and what you might need to spend more time on in the classroom. So in this case, the first question I've been given is a kind of a labeling question, if you like. I need to drag the items to the correct positions. It's also a good opportunity to say that Adapt compares really favorably to lots of other platforms you might have come across in terms of the variety of questions that students will encounter. So here they're dragging labels. They'll also have questions that require them to kind of drag items into categories. There are multiple choice questions, fill in the gap questions, right through to, in areas of maths and some areas of science, kind of more complex calculation-based questions where the students will enter a kind of multi-part calculation, and the platform will mark not just their final answer, but also their working and how they got there. So in this case, let's say that we're going to get it wrong. I'm going to put these in and say I'm not sure. So what you can see has happened here is it's reminding me that I said I wasn't sure. It's telling me I'm not quite there yet. It's telling me which ones I got right, which ones I got wrong. I can then either drag, I can say show me at the bottom here, and it'll correct the diagram for me. You can imagine in the case of a fill in the gap exercise or a multiple choice exercise, it would show me the answer I selected or entered compared with the answer I should have selected or entered. And then crucially, you've got the learn more option. So I can click here on the heart. It'll give me some learning content about the heart, which will help me to answer a question correctly next time I come to a question on this particular area. And then having answered this question partially correctly, but ultimately incorrectly and with a low level of confidence, you can imagine that as I make my way through, I will come back to this again in order for the platform to be satisfied that I've mastered it. Here's an example of a multiple choice question. And yeah, again, just giving you a sense of the range of different question types. Some multiple choice questions will ask you to tick all options that apply. Some will ask you to tick one correct answer. And I think what we'll do at that stage is pop back to the dashboard, if only not to expose my lack of knowledge of the heart. And what we'll do is flick over to the teacher view, which you should be able to see now. Bethan, are you able to give me a thumbs up?
Yep. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so the teacher view here, much as with the students, the teachers land on a dashboard. So this is the teacher version of that dashboard. In the center here, I've got all of the tasks that are currently kind of in progress for my class or classes. On the right-hand side, I've got my classes. So actually, in this case, this particular teacher only has access to or is only responsible for one class. Probably reasonable to assume that in the case of most secondary teachers, they would probably have more than one class over here. If they did, they'd be able to select the name of a class to filter this central area just for one particular group. Also, over on the right-hand side, this is where I would go to kind of do things like adding a new student or moving a student between classes or resetting passwords, but we won't spend too much time looking at those kinds of things today. Really, the key things and the things we're going to spend the remainder of the demo looking at are over on this left-hand side. So I've got the set work option, which, as the name would suggest, is where I would go to set a piece of work for either a class or a group of classes. I've then got reports, which is where I go to find out how students have got on with the work I have already set for them. And then I've got the library, which is where I view, where I can go to view all of the content I have access to as part of my school's subscription. So the two things we're going to focus on really are set work and reports. So let's have a look first of all at set work. So first part of this is selecting the class or classes that I want to set the work for. So as I mentioned, this particular teacher is only attached to one class called IGCSE Science, so that's pre-selected. If you did have access to more than one class, and including if you had access to lots of classes, all of those would appear here, and it's very straightforward for you to select either one or more classes. So if you want to set pretty much the same piece of work across multiple classes, you can do that in one process without having to repeat it. By default, anything you set is going to be set to all students in that class or classes, but you do also have the option to set it just for selected students within the class. So if you have classes where students are working at a range of ability levels, it may be that you want to set slightly differentiated versions of the same piece of work. This allows you to do that. And then self-study, I'll just very briefly mention, I touched on this a few minutes ago, actually. This is what would allow you as a teacher to just give access to the content to your students. So rather than perhaps setting an assignment as homework or as an in-class activity, you might be setting them up with access to lots of modules for their own use, for example, in a revision period. So maybe you want Adapt to be one of the many tools that's available to them to help with their revision. So rather than saying, I want you to go and do this very specific piece of work about the heart, just to take the previous example, it might be that you're saying, your biology exam's coming up, here's all the biology content, go in and do it as you see fit. So the next part of the process, select the content. So I've got chemistry and biology here. Well, why not continue with biology? Even if you're not a biology teacher or even a science teacher, don't worry. The process is very much the same, regardless of the subject. And in a second, I'll come back to which subjects are available on Adapt. So, next stage, modules. So, within IGCSE biology, you've got a number of modules. These modules are designed to be the right kind of size to be a discrete piece of work. So whether that's a homework or an in-class activity that might take the average student somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes to complete, albeit a caveat there that this is an adaptive learning platform, of course, and therefore it is going to take different students different lengths of time to complete them, because it will take the time, particularly if they're struggling, to make sure they've mastered it before they complete the piece of work. So the easiest thing to do here is to say, for example, I want to set this module on classifying organisms. So I'll just select that and move on. But I do have the additional ability to drill right down into the content. So if I click on the pencil icon here, I can see all of the specific learning objectives that make up this module. And it may be that we've covered the majority of this already in class, but actually we haven't yet covered these last 3 learning objectives, for example. So I can uncheck those, and those won't appear in the assignment when it appears to the students. And as you use the platform more and more, what you can see is which of these you've already set for the selected class or classes. So let's just say that we're going to select that module. I can give my piece of work a title. So by default, it will be set to the module name, but you may have a way of naming homework and or classwork in your school, homework 1, week 1 homework, those kinds of things. And then the last section will be very familiar to you from any kind of digital learning platform that you've used. So I can set the piece of work either with an open end date or with a fixed end date. And likewise, I can set it with either to appear immediately, so with a start date of right now, or I can set it to appear from a fixed date. And that can be helpful if, for example, at the beginning of term, you're wanting to set up homeworks for each week throughout the term that will only appear when that date comes around. One other thing, actually, I'll quickly mention is late submission. This is something we introduced in response to some feedback from teachers. So initially, when we launched Adapt, it was the case that once the end date for a particular assignment had passed, that those modules or those cards would disappear from the student's dashboard. So what was then happening was that actually we were creating work for teachers, because teachers were having to go in and edit the assignments to extend them so as the students could go in and complete the work. So what you now have the option to do is to allow late submission. So after the end date has passed, the work will still appear on the student's dashboard, but crucially, as a teacher, when you're looking at the reports, looking at who's done what, you can see who's submitted that work late. Okay, so oh no, I was ahead of myself there. I was about to head back to PowerPoint, but one last section to look at is reports. So yes, very important to be able to set the work, and hopefully you've seen how straightforward that is. But also, once you have done that, you want to be able to check whether they've completed the work. So there are actually a few ways you can get into the reports. So there's obviously this big button that says reports over on the left-hand side. But if I wanted specifically to look at the reports for a particular assignment, then I can click on the reports icon on the assignment card here. Likewise, if I've got lots of classes down here and I want to look at the reports specifically for one of those classes, there's a reports icon there. But I'm going to start by clicking here. It will initially bring up this view, which has got some high-level reports. So it's telling me which of my students are inactive versus active. So inactive students haven't logged in for the past 30 days. I've also got a view here of how many students have logged in per day over the last 30 days. And then at the bottom, I've got a very high-level overview of all of my classes, which, as I say, in this case is just one. That tells me how many modules have been set for this class and the kind of average completion. So if I click on that class, it will launch a new page. There we go. So first couple of reports you'll recognize from the previous page, so I won't go over those again. But as I start to move down, there are some different reports here. So I've got all the work that's been set for this class. So each of the pieces of work or assignments here, the average completion across the students in the class for each of those, the number of students that are active or that have started the work, and then the total time spent. I've also got this report, trickiest learning objectives. I mentioned this briefly before. So this is telling me which areas the students in this class have particularly struggled with. So I can see this at a class level. I can see this at an assignment level. I can also see it at an individual student level. And it tells me, as I say, which of the learning objectives, the quite granular specific learning objectives have tripped up students most often. And that might be an indicator as to either topics that I need to spend a bit more time on in the classroom with those students, or it might just be that as a teacher, I need to kind of dig into why it might be that the students are struggling in those particular areas. Moving down a little bit further. So this is kind of an extension of that report showing each of the pieces of work. So in this case, the pieces of work are along the top: IGCSE Biology Week 1, IGCSE Chemistry Week 1, which you'll recall from the earlier report. And then I've got each of the students down the left-hand side. I can see that all of these students have completed the assignment. That's what's indicated by the 100% and the green. These two students haven't started yet. And you can see this kind of different lengths of time it took each of them to complete it. And as with most of the things on this page, I mean, we're only going to do a high-level summary today of the reporting that's available, but invariably you can click on anything here. So for example, I could click on a student to then dig right down into exactly how this particular student has been getting on, including information about whether they've completed their assignments on time, that kind of thing. The last thing I wanted to show you was this metacognition levels report. So this breaks down, for each student, breaks down all of the responses they've given into the 4 quadrants related to metacognition. So the one that you will recognize is this one, unconsciously incorrect, which in my presentation I think was labeled as unconsciously incompetent. So that's where they've answered a question wrong or incorrectly, but they thought they knew the answer. Then right through to the deep green color here, this quadrant, which is consciously correct or consciously competent, that refers to where they've answered a question both correctly and confidently. And that's really where we're trying to move people to in ADAPT. In the middle, there are the 2 other quadrants as well, which I'll just briefly explain. So consciously incorrect, those are the students that are answering questions incorrectly, but are saying, I don't know, or I'm not sure. So they're aware that it's a gap in their knowledge. And then the other quadrant, which you can't actually quite see here, is unconsciously correct. So these are the students that are answering questions correctly, but with a low degree of confidence. So they're not quite prepared to say, I know it. They're either saying just, I think I know it, or even I'm not sure. And again, you want those students to move towards this, the confident and correct section. Okay, so I think with that, we will move back to PowerPoint. So bear with me again while I just unshare and reshare my screen. One second. Okay, so just a few more slides to finish us off before we'll have some time for questions. So starting off with a recap, now that we've had a look at some adaptive learning for ourselves, both in terms of the initial presentation and then also the run through of ADAPT. So to recap on the key points, with ADAPT, we're not talking about gamified learning. Its focus is on mastery over speed, and it's not about being competitive. ADAPT rewards effort and reflection, and it ensures that learning time is targeted most effectively in every session. Engagement improves because the experience is meaningful to individuals and nobody's left behind. And also, from a teacher's perspective, teachers can see exactly where learning gaps are for each individual. And before we finish, I wanted to talk a bit about efficacy in relation to ADAPT. So looking at learner pathways, which I have talked about a little bit, but this diagram illustrates it perhaps a little bit more clearly. So with most digital learning, you see it follow what you would call a linear sequence. So slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, or page after page, or a video. These diagrams show the actual paths 3 learners took in our platform as they built their proficiency in an adaptive course. So these paths are completely typical of learners across any subject or level, far from linear. Each of the bubbles, the kind of circles, represents a learning objective. The size of the bubble represents the number of interactions the learner had with each learning objective. So basically, the number of questions they answered related to that learning objective. The green bubble is where they started, the first learning objective in the course, and the red is the last one. So what this is illustrating is that the adaptive learning moves backwards and forwards through the learning objectives as the learners succeeded in some cases or struggled to learn in other cases. So really the summary is linear learning is the simplest choice when what you're primarily concerned with is them completing the course. But if the measure becomes mastery or proficiency or kind of the quality of learning, then the paths need to adapt to the needs of the individual. And that's where adaptive learning comes in. So every learner becoming 100% proficient, but the time and route they take varying considerably. So in terms of adapt, I said I would come back to subjects, and here we are. So the subjects available as of now, I know that we have an audience today of international teachers. So I'll start by talking about the Cambridge IGCSE. So as of August, we now have content or courses on ADAPT for both Cambridge IGCSE Maths and also Cambridge IGCSE Science. That's both the individual biology, chemistry and physics courses and also the combined and coordinated sciences. In addition to that, there's lots of UK curriculum content for lower secondary and GCSE, for maths, science, history and geography. And I know that this session is primarily focused on secondary learning, but there is also content there or courses there for primary maths from years 1 through to 6. So this is my final slide. Really, the message here is that we invite you to explore the Adapt platform in a bit more depth with a personalized digital demo from one of our team. If you scan the QR code or get in contact directly through the email address listed, collins.international@harpercollins.co.uk, you can set up an online demo with one of our team. In that session, they'll walk you through the platform with time for you to ask as many questions as you like. You'll be able to experience the content as a student and see the in-depth reporting and ease of setting work as a teacher. And there's no commitment to subscribe after the demo. And I would add to that the page I showed you a little bit earlier in the presentation. So before even setting up the demo, it's perfectly possible for you to go to our website and, as the website says, take a quick look. So click on one of the links for one of the subjects or levels, or for more of the subjects and levels, and launch the platform to experience it for yourself.